Professor Mészáros, uma distinção essencial na sua obra é aquela entre capital e capitalismo, limites diferenciados entre um e outro. Na sua visão, os chamados estados socialistas que desapareceram recentemente teriam rompido com o capitalismo, mas não com o capital. Queria saber o que seria necessário para romper com o que o senhor chama de metabolismo do capital. E, particularmente, no caso da União Soviética, de que forma ela induziu, na sua visão, esse metabolismo. Desde o começo, quando Lenin definiu o socialismo como a industrialização mais dos sovietes, ou quando definiu a NEP, ou quando Stalin definiu a industrialização forçada, ou se desde o começo, por ser um país periférico, já estava condenado ao metabolismo do capital.
The big problem in the Soviet Union was the backwardness of its economy, backwardness of the society in general. In fact, when the whole process started, Lenin and the Bolsheviks were hoping that the Russian Revolution will be followed by other revolutions. So this terrible backwardness of the society can be remedied by those societies, by the revolution in those societies, Germany, England, and others, which were far more advanced at the industrial and agricultural level. And I mean, that was, I think, one of the tragedies of the historical situation, that the leaders of this revolution put their faith into something over which they had no control whatsoever. Because if the revolution in those other countries doesn't come about, as in fact it didn't, what can you do? And Lenin's answer was almost a pessimistic answer. He said, well, we can't just hand back the power to the Tsar. So we have to carry on the way we can. It's a holding operation. He used this expression. It's a holding operation until the situation becomes much more favorable. So it can proceed in a certain way. Now, Lenin's position, therefore, wasn't what became later the position of Stalin, that we are going to build socialism in a single country. That was a non-starter. There was never any possibility of building socialism in the world, in this enormous world, on the basis of an extremely backward economy. So Stalin turned this holding operation, according to Lenin, which is defined in strictly temporary terms, into a model. That was, therefore, had terrible with its consequences in other directions, for other parties, for all those parties which try to follow the Stalinist line. Because if you admit honestly that what you are doing is developing a society from an extremely primitive economic basis towards something higher, that's one thing. If you then decree at the same time that this is the model for all socialist transformation, only big trouble can come out of that. And I think that is, when we consider these problems, they must be always re-examined historically. The tendency, unfortunately, of parties in the context in which they operate is to push aside the historical dimension and idealize themselves. And this is not only for true about the party of Stalin, it is true about many parties in the world. Some of the parties which are in existence today. I come from England, and that the party which is in government today in England calls itself New Labour, and idealize itself in the same way as often parties do. Now, I think if we are serious about returning to the program of a socialist transformation, as I am convinced myself that we must, then this idealization, this ahistorical idealization, is what must be pushed aside. And instead of this ahistorical idealization, decreeing models, because Stalin was not the only one decreeing models. Now the model which is decreed in England is the model of the third world, the third way, the third road. The third road as a model. My goodness, it sounds to me a very bad joke when your alternatives are quite dramatic, and then you decide that the real model is to follow a third. You don't consider either one or the other, but invent a third. And I think returning to the Soviet Union, the trouble was that from this conception, this idealized conception of a model, the Stalinist model, terrible consequences followed for other countries, especially for Germany, where Stalin's line meant that the Social Democratic Party had to be denounced as social fascists, and the socialists and the Social Democrats as one of the socialist, potentially socialist forces, were turned against communists and vice versa. And Hitler benefited enormously from it. And I could go on what happened later on in Eastern Europe, where also a great deal of damage was produced by imposing on those societies this Stalinist kind of model for which there was no basis in reality.
Professor Istvan, já que o senhor tocou na questão da União Soviética, a imprensa brasileira sempre diz aos brasileiros em geral, aos seus leitores de uma forma geral, que o socialismo ou o comunismo acabaram com a queda do Muro de Berlim e sempre tomam conta, como exemplo, a União Soviética, como o senhor explicou agora há pouco. É fato mesmo que o comunismo acabou, como insistem alguns setores, até da intelectualidade brasileira e mundial?
Well, it depends what you mean by communism. Because in the first place, by Marx, communism was defined as the higher stage of socialism, where again it was emphasized that historically you can't jump to that stage. You can't. You have to resolve some enormous fundamental problems of society. Again, this question of transition, how do you get from one type of society, one type of social metabolic reproduction to the other. So they have to be resolved. They have their own conditions, both objective conditions and subjective conditions, because it's not enough to produce material goods. You also have to transform the people. And in that sense, Marx was talking about that under communist type of higher level of society, and the people to go with it who have been educated in this spirit, they are supposed to produce according to their abilities and receive from the social pool according to their need. Now, if you consider both sides of this equation, you can only you can only produce according to your abilities if you have a substantial agreement with the purposes, with the aims of that society. If you are in disagreement, especially if you are in violent disagreement, then you refuse to produce according to their abilities. What do you do instead? You do the absolute minimum, and maybe not even that, because you can also interfere with the production and push it back. And what about the rewarding people according to their need? Well, that's again, who is going to decide what are the needs of the people? In the Stalinist kind of system, it was that bureaucratic operation which decided for you and me and everybody else what are your legitimate needs. So if you think of that type of society as communism, well, that is obviously dead. You're right, that is dead. But for me, that was not a communist society in any sense of the word. For you might even say it was stillborn. It was born dead, if you like, already, because of those historical and other constraints. And to refer it to the collapse of the Soviet system, which is also a historical reality, it's a fact. Obviously, some people draw from it the conclusion that, all right, there is no more problem. Socialism, communism is dead, and capitalism triumphs, and forever and ever we live under this system. Well, unfortunately, with this kind of looking at the problems, is that we are not going to live very long if we follow the imperatives of the system which controls our society, our social metabolism. And that's why I would say, no, socialism is not at all dead. It is there as a challenge for the future. But we must learn from the terrible contradictions of the past, because without that we could only repeat it. The reason why I spent 25 years of my life writing this book is primarily with regard to the future, because I'm convinced that the problems will arise again for the future. And if we don't learn from the past, that future is very dark, because the dangers of humanity's self-destruction through capital, through the power of the capital, the logic of capital, the objective imperatives of capital, is such, the irrationality which characterizes the system is such that if we are not careful, if we don't devise an alternative way of controlling all aspects of our life, within very easily foreseeable period of time, we'll be all dead.